Hello and welcome to Artcast, a podcast from the Royal College of Art, home to the next generation of creatives and the world's #1 art and design university, representing the largest concentration of postgraduate artists and designers on the planet. We'll be bringing you insight into the philosophy behind the programmes at the RCA by talking to staff, students and the wider RCA community about what we do here and how the work of architects, artists, communicators, designers and researchers affect the world at large. I'm Benji Jeffrey, and today I'll be talking to Chris Mitchell about creative education and how this form of education can help people respond to the challenges of living with uncertainty. Chris is an experienced leader in UK higher education with expertise in strategy development, curriculum design, and educational innovation, and he is the Deputy Director of Academic Development here at the RCA. Thank you for joining us today, Chris.
It's a pleasure.
How are you doing?
Very well.
Good. So let's just jump in with the big difficult question straight away. So what makes a creative education distinct from other forms of education?
I think this is such an interesting question. And I think one of the things for me that makes it's so distinctive is the immediacy of some of these kind of fundamental educational principles. Because we have done exercises with a whole range of different disciplines and asked them, what is learning? What is teaching? These really basic questions. And what's interesting is when you ask creative artists that question, very quickly they get to answers, really fundamental answers like learning how to be, learning that fires your imagination and allows you to then apply that imagination to the problems that you're facing. Now, what's I think fascinating about that is if you spend time with other disciplines, they will get to the same point often, but it takes a lot longer.
Right.
Is that immediacy you get with creative artists. There's a really clear sense of this is what I'm here to do. Mm-hmm. And also, compared to a lot of other disciplines, it's quite content light. Like if you sit down and talk to a whole range of different academics from different disciplines, they'll say, well, the things you need to know if you are a geologist or if you're an economist are this, this and this and this. So that's the kind of fundamentals and you'll build from that. I don't think there is that in the creative arts and arguably in some areas like architecture or some of the design areas, there's things definitely they will want to kind of teach you in order to be able to be a functioning architect or designer. But a lot of the time, the canon is A, quite small, and B, very fluid. And that's a really interesting part of the kind of creative arts is that notion that the rules, there aren't very many fixed rules to play with. And that gives you quite a large playground. It gives you quite a lot of space for your own imagination.
Mm. It's almost like there's two different tracks, isn't there, within this education? There's the technical side of things, and then there's the cognitive side of things, which sometimes are more to do with undoing than doing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, we've debated at length the notion of undoing. And this came into kind of sharp relief for us when we were talking about the changes that have been to a whole range of different disciplines. So the RCA, obviously, is a postgraduate institution. Mm. And we got very used to the idea that there's a whole range of undergraduate institutions providing us with students. And what happens when the sector changes is that the backgrounds that students bring with them changes. So, for example, in our case, ceramics and glass. We've got a ceramics and glass course. We've had it for many, many years. It's been incredibly successful. And it built on the idea that you will probably have done an undergraduate degree in ceramics and or glass. What's interesting is that has changed. The sector has changed. There are fewer of those undergraduate degrees. And some of the assumptions that people might bring with them, that people understand sort of the technical side, the material, how material behaves around clay or with the glass, is when you take those out, initially I think there's that temptation to kind of go, well, that's a shame. But I think what's been really interesting in order to continue to flourish as a postgraduate degree is that idea of saying, well, they don't necessarily have an understanding, a grounding in the technical properties. So maybe we are going to have to do that as well at a postgraduate level. But what do they bring instead? Mm. What do we get from having students from a whole range of different backgrounds coming here? And I think that has been a really interesting process and a really good example for me of the different ways in which this institution and other institutions like it have had to adapt to the changing worlds, and some of the assumptions that we may once have had about our students no longer being relevant.
And I guess that kind of ties into the idea of the questioning of the canon as well, right? The questioning of what modes of knowledge are seen as important, or what forms of knowledge move between being a hobbyist and being a professional as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that fundamental question is, if there isn't a well-established canon, what is it that we're doing here? That's a really fundamental question. You're spending a lot of time, you're spending a lot of effort and resource in coming to study at a place like the RCA. And it's sometimes really difficult from a curriculum designer's point of view is to say, well, in the absence of that canon, what am I getting? Now, for our answer is often we're creating the environment for you to develop the sort of intellectual, technical and professional skills to be able to flourish beyond. But it's a lot harder sell than it is, I think, for us, than it is for some other disciplines who can be much more explicit. It's about this, this and this.
And you've been taking the lead on the postgraduate certificate in art and design education here at the RCA. So are there any kind of examples of how, because again, the next layer, I guess, is how do you teach people to teach something that doesn't have anything to be taught? Or, I'm being a bit cheeky with that. Yeah.
And that is often the thing about any kind of educational degrees or educational development, is that notion of the snake eating itself, is that you're teaching about teaching. And I think for us, I mean, the PG cert that we launched here 4 years ago, and it has been through sort of many different hands. Lots of people have been the program lead for that. I was there at the start, but I haven't always been the program lead. Is it changes, it morphs, but it is about looking at the assumptions that people make and about making all of the decisions that you make as an educator explicit ones. So I think I've looked at a lot of different kind of programs and a lot of different institutions, and some institutions will mandate people to go on these kind of internal PG certs. And then you get a lot of crossed arms. You get a lot of people saying, oh, I have to do this. And I think a lot of the fear about people who are mandated to do this kind of thing is, you're going to tell me what I'm doing is wrong.
Right.
And I don't think that's ever the case, because it's not as if we can say what's right. No one is going to be able to say, oh, there's been lots of research, and we know that the best way of someone to learn is this. In fact, I've seen lots of people, not necessarily in this institution, but a lot of different contexts, saying research says this. And you're thinking, yeah, give me 10 minutes and I'll find some research that says exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
But I think it's that thing of, it's not necessarily telling you you're wrong. It's also not telling you you're right. It's about making sure that the decisions that you make as an educator are informed. You understand what it is that's informing them, and you're explicit about that. So for me, it would be a success if someone comes out of that and saying, actually, the decisions I'm making, I still think are good ones, but I understand why I'm making them. And I understand what the impact of those decisions now are.
Yeah. And I wonder, because there's a difficulty, isn't there, when education becomes more and more standardized, that you can sometimes lose that flavor, that individual flavor, which is a real shame. So I think it's good that people, I suppose these teaching programs are about emboldening people to trust what they do rather than standardizing.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting tension, because in my role, I spend a lot of time teaching education. Also, in another part of my role is looking at curriculum design from an institutional point of view. And I'm often the sort of one on the other side of the table, kind of saying, well, write your learning outcomes, design the curriculum, evidence why you're doing this and what you're doing. And I think it comes fundamentally down to, what is your approach to learning? What do you fundamentally think learning is? And I am an advocate of curriculum designers writing things down in learning outcomes in a kind of well-structured curriculum. But fundamentally, I think, my point of view, there are others, is that learning is a fundamentally messy thing.
Yeah.
It cannot be pinned down.
Yeah.
It cannot be saying, well, if I do this, then that will happen. And, so many studies have tried to demonstrate, in a good way, if we do this, will it achieve what we want to achieve? And the answer is always, well, you might be able to, at best, demonstrate that someone can do something that they couldn't do previously. It's almost impossible to demonstrate that the thing you did your intervention is the thing, because it's not a scientific experiment.
Yeah.
You can't isolate them for the kind of multifarious variations of the world.
Yeah.
But that's okay. So as a curriculum designer, absolutely, you need to be really clear what you're doing, why you're doing it. My particular take on what learning is expect it to be messy.
Yeah.
Expect students to go off in their own directions and glory in that.
Yeah. And in this idea of messiness, and in a world where we can find YouTube tutorials and where we can find conversations with people, why would someone go into a creative education and not just build it themselves?
Oh, well, part of me thinks if you can, great.
Yeah.
I think what studying or enrolling in a program of study gives you is yes, you've got a lot of expertise behind you. You've got a lot of institutional structures behind you that's saying that we have made all these decisions because we have tried and tested this in lots of different ways, and we'll provide you with a structure. But also, I think it really, really helps to provide the structure of kind of motivations, in a sense. Is it's very easy to say, if you're entirely on your own, oh, maybe I won't do it. Whereas if someone is saying, right, we expect you to be doing this, so you'll be opened up to more ideas than necessarily you would do if you're entirely guided by a YouTube algorithm. But it also creates a structure for you to kind of keep your motivation up. And I think crucially, it provides you other people to study with. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we say to curriculum designers here at the college, and keep on saying, and I'm sure I'll keep on saying it as long as I am at the college, is all this stuff matters. Your curriculum design, your discipline, all that matters. You matter as a teacher. It doesn't matter quite as much as the other students. We've asked this question in the student survey every single year for as long as I can remember. What is the best thing about the college? And the answer is always the same thing. Other students. Now, for some people, I could find that quite depressing because you spend a lot of time and resource in developing the kind of physical and intellectual atmosphere. But I think it's great. Yeah. I think you're tapping into the fundamental thing is learning alongside other people. And I think that is quite a difficult thing to replicate on your own.
And I think there's the joy in that of people that are on these kind of flexible paths, coming back to what you were saying about ceramics and glass before, you know, being part of a network where maybe someone's done physics, someone's done fine art, someone's done textiles, and actually you're all together doing digital direction, for example. It's quite a kind of like, there's some great friction there and excitement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really interesting about some of the new programs that we're offering in September is that they've all been developed at the same time, and it enables us to put in the structures to do it proper electives. So you can come in on this program, and from my point of view, I'm thinking, well, you know, in order to be able to kind of progress through the program, I want you to have done this unit and this unit, and this unit builds on that. But at various points, whether it's the part-time or the full-time option, they're going to get to go off and do an elective in a completely different school with completely different staff. And I think it's brilliant.
And one of these pathways, which I believe you're leading on, is the creative education pathway. What does that look like?
Well, what we've done is it's not a sort of introduction to education.
Right.
Well, so we took the decision quite early on, not just to do a sort of kind of a basic education program, because I think it's because also we want to give options for our own students to potentially choose electives in our area as well, and that wouldn't be particularly palatable to them. So we're offering up 2 electives to the rest of the college, which again our students are free to take as well. One of which is called Education for Change, which is the idea of designing and delivering education that's specifically addressing social issues, which is a massive and increasingly big issue. And it's about, again, providing the kind of intellectual and sort of professional environment to engage with those issues and to try things out, which is the kind of fundamental principle for us. And the second one, elective that we're offering up, is called Making Pedagogy. So it's a reflection on what it means to, again, design and deliver education that involves the act of making, that involves the act of creating digital and kind of physical artifacts. And how does that change what it is that you're doing as a student and what you're designing as a teacher? So those are what we're offering up. I'll be honest, I am as excited about all of the other electives that the other programs are developing. I'm really looking forward to understanding how an individual student's sort of journey changes according to what they do. So we'll have some students potentially choosing our options. Great. We'll have some students who are going off saying, no, that's fine. I'm going to go off and do storytelling. And I'm so looking forward to seeing what happens, to see, as students progress throughout the program and end towards their independent research project, what influence those electives have on what it is that they are fundamentally interested in and what they want to spend 600 study hours doing for their research project.
And with this idea of the kind of social changes and communities, this is maybe too tricky a question, but is there a distinction then between a teacher and a facilitator?
Oh, I think there is. And I think it goes back to that question, which is often asked, is, do you need a teacher to learn? To which I think the obvious answer is no, you don't need a teacher. And I think it's about the increasing recognition of the changes of your role, particularly, I would say, at postgraduate level. Because maybe at previous levels, you could be reasonably assured that you were in a more advanced position than some of your students. Looking at the people who already to study at the RCA, some of them, well, many of them are already pretty advanced in their careers, have already got quite a lot to show for it, and will be entering into the same competitions and processes as the staff. Again, brilliant. So you got in a situation where the student might know more than you about some areas. Again, I think it's a good thing. But I think it does shift the role. And to give you kind of a practical example of how my teaching has changed on this, because we place so much emphasis, and I've always placed so much emphasis on group work and collaboration, what I notice is that whenever you kind of go to group work, as long as you've designed it well enough, there's always a momentum. There's always an energy in the room when people go off and you give them a prompt, they go off and talk about it. And what's really interesting is when they come back and you ask them to report back, a lot of that energy just disappears. That excitement people have about engaging with interesting issues with other people, it goes. And you go, right, group 3, can you report back? And again, that energy is gone. And part of me is thinking, well, why am I doing this plenary? Why am I doing this feeding back? Who's it for? And I'm thinking, I think it's for me. I think it's for me as a teacher. And whatever interesting is actually I'm not going to do that so much. They've had a fantastic discussion. There might be evidence of that on an online collaboration board or whatever the thing might be. Maybe they don't need to tell me what their discussion is. Maybe they can just have that discussion. And again, that for me is that switch from a teacher who needs to know it all to a facilitator who's creating opportunities for students to have interesting conversations with interesting people and leave it there. So that's sort of my answer to that.
Yeah, I guess it's the distinction, isn't it, between what learning is and what evidencing for assessment is, which I think has a lot to do with how art school has evolved, right? Because art school was one distinct thing and then university was kind of blueprinted on top of it.
Yeah. And I think the really interesting area there is about the notion of experimentation, because you will not find an art school in the world that doesn't talk about innovation and experimentation. And I think where that issue comes into sharp relief is when you get to the assessment and it's saying, be bold, be risky, be innovative, but also get it right.
Yeah.
Because your assessment is based around the presentation of the product, whatever the product may be, even the product is a painting or it's a schematic or whatever it might be. And I think that's the really interesting tension. I think if we are encouraging, as we are, students to take risks, and risks inevitably involve, by a certain kind of criteria, failures, then I think it's really important that our assessment processes recognise that. I mean, that you are not penalised for it not turning out beautifully or exactly as you would hope it to be, that the assessment is as much about the process of learning as it is about generating something you can present at a show. There's always a time when actually you do want to say, this I'm really proud of and I want to show it off. But throughout the program, there should be lots of opportunities to creatively fail, because I think you learn much more from that than about things that you kind of think that's perfect.
Yeah. I mean, I spoke to Martin about this in the first podcast, and I sort of imagine this is going to be a running theme for everything, which is the art school paradox, which is the more you fail, the better you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
In some ways. So thinking about the way that these things are embedded in art school, how do these ideas start to move out into the world?
Well, that is a tricky question to answer. I think, in part, there's two sides to it for me. One of which is directly engaging with the world through your studies. And I think what's really interesting is you see more in this institution, but also across the whole kind of UK HE sector, about doing things like grand challenges, doing things which involve community engagement. So you're directly involving them in that process. And I think that's a really positive thing, although I think there's sometimes a tension there around the idea that universities presenting themselves as solving other people's problems. And I think the key thing for me in that relationship between an institution and the communities it engages with is they are doing us a favour. We're not doing them a favour. And I think that's a key thing to establish when you're engaging with communities beyond your own. Then I think there's that thing of explicitly talking with students and discussing them and giving them opportunities to try things out to enable them to then engage effectively with the world. And it goes to fundamental questions like ethics, for example. So, as an institution, as with many institutions, we previously took quite a deficit model towards ethics. We would say it's a preventative process. It's preventing you from exposing yourself to harm. It's preventing you from exposing others to harm. But what's been really interesting over the last few years is you switch that model and saying, well, not only can the experience of education and research be a beneficial thing, but it's actually fundamentally setting you up with the ethical tools to be able to engage with the world beyond your graduation. And if it's not doing that, if ethics and those issue about community engagement is not part of your practice by the end, then probably we're not doing it quite right.
And it seems like there has been a big switch in the ethics of how people engage with the world at large over the last few years. For example, Heart and Soul, who work with people who are neurodivergent, to highlight what they do rather than telling someone this is a way of doing something.
Yeah.
Which is really important. There's also a tricky thing with the ethics as well, right? In terms of the being willing to fail at an institution, because within group work, there can be tricky stuff where perhaps people come with difficult relationships to ethics that we are then asking them to bring to the fore in order to explore, which might not be so good for other students.
Yeah, we do place a lot of emphasis on collaboration, and you recognise that it often does go wrong. But particularly, I think, if you scale up the importance, so for example, we have for some of the units, we have collaborative assessment for part of it. So you have to do something, develop something with other people, which creates, in many cases, some fantastic relationships where everyone is having a wonderful time. And in some cases, not. I think the key thing is what kind of framework are you providing for those students to do it? So I think just saying collaboration is important, you're going to collaborate, and abandoning them to that is a problem. I think you've got to kind of say, if we think, for example, that collaboration is a fundamental part of being an educator, or possibly even being someone who has a creative practice, then you've got to then design things around it. So to give people opportunities to talk, well, what does this mean? Again, turn that implicit to the explicit.
Yeah. And I guess that's another way of thinking through how to kind of build the world you want to see as well, right? Because hopefully people will collaborate in these environments, and then when they go out to potentially start businesses, there'll be a memory of that collaborative process, which might come into their employment ideas as well.
And so on that we talk a little bit at the start about this notion of generous thinking. And it really is, I think, quite incredibly important to us, is that actually academic institutions, we can often celebrate ourselves for being kind of wonderful places where you're free to say whatever you want. But some of the things that when maybe some of the assumptions that we want to test are problems that we have about status competition within institutions or between institutions. And that thinking, what is happening when someone is presenting their ideas? Are you thinking, well, actually, I want to prove that mine are better, or that I'm better than you? Or that notion of generous thinking, which was sort of developed by Kathleen Fitzpatrick, I think, is that notion of not just can you understand what it is that someone is saying, but how can you help them understand? Because often when we're presenting ideas for the first time, we're all over the shop.
Yeah.
And actually, rather than saying, I'm going to demonstrate that your ideas aren't as good as you think they are, or I'm going to demonstrate that my ideas are better than yours, it's saying, how can I help that person reframe, articulate, question what it is that they're presenting in order to support them, and then reciprocate so that I get the same benefit in return. So it's those kind of things I think are really fundamental to set up as an ethos at the start.
And there are really important things in terms of the evolution of art education and design education, that moving away from this idea of the old master who knows absolutely everything, and if they haven't said it, it's not worth it.
Yeah. And you often, it's interesting we did a project a few years ago looking back at old prospectuses, or college prospectuses.
Right.
And you see that kind of writ large in so many of them, that sort of discussion about the atelier model. As you will, as you say, learn at the feet of your master. And that's a really interesting kind of situation when our students' average age is 27. And hopefully with some of the new programs, that average age starts pushing up again, is that, it's actually quite a freeing point of view from a staff member's point of view, going, you don't have to be the master. Mm-hmm. And maybe you will learn as much from them as they will learn from you.
Yeah.
Great.
Which I think at postgraduate level is what you want to be happening much more
absolutely.
as well, right? It's less to do with just being a sponge,
exactly.
Perhaps as BA is at some point. So do you have any advice for people who want to engage with the idea of creative education? Are there any artists or texts, galleries, events, things like that?
I think, and I hear this advice in a whole range of different contexts, but I think it works equally well for education, is when you are experiencing education, or whether you are experiencing it as an individual learner or just witnessing it, think about the choices that people are making. Really analyze that situation, because there's a whole range of different things that in terms of what the room looks like, where the teacher is, what they've asked you to do, what they're kind of moving towards. All of these are active choices that someone has made, some of which they may have more control over than others. But I think it's really, when I quite enjoy this, particularly when the pressure is off me as a teacher, is actually looking and saying, well, on what basis are they doing this? Why are they doing that? What are they trying to get to? Why have they done that? And so I definitely think if you are someone who is interested in education, analyze, be a learner, analyze what happens. And I hesitate to mention this, but you're one of the people who've been through the PG Cert. And what's really interesting is that a lot of people like you is like you're going to get used to the role of being a teacher. And suddenly you're back to being a student. And all of the kind of behaviours that a lot of our kind of staff will go, oh, students are doing this again. They then exhibit themselves when they become a student. And I think it's that really interesting is analyse that. What's going on there?
Yeah. And I guess that comes back again to the idea of non-standardizing the way that things are done. It's more about standardizing what the intent of the activity is rather than standardizing what the activity itself is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there are so many people that are worth reading if you want to sort of really get your head around education. But I think starting off with people like bell hooks, because I think one of the interesting things, but particularly within a sort of creative arts point of view, is that notion of questioning your assumptions. And we exist within kind of powerful structures. And I think is really understanding, and we are subject to those powerful structures as well, is really understanding what it is that the relationship is between the institution and the teacher and the student in the institution. I think it's trying to read a little bit more about that is a really fundamental thing. Because I've probably done this to you at some point, but I think it's absolutely fascinating that you walk into a room and you don't know anyone there, and one human being stands up, often in front of a screen, and they ask you to do stuff, and you do it. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. Or don't. Or they don't do it.
I think it's incredible that so often they do.
Yeah. But this is meant to be an interview of me, but just a story that because I like to use Pauline Oliveros's tuning meditation as a thing that I do with students, which is where basically everyone contributes vocally to a texture that's created by matching someone else's note. And whenever I do it, it goes really, really well. And everyone gets involved. And even if they're a bit nervous at the beginning, they get into it. But the last time that I did it in a group activity, I spent 20 minutes sitting in silence with me being the only person that made a noise. And it was really difficult because you get, once again, I guess it's about reading the room, right?
Yeah.
Because I became so confident in the fact that this is the one thing I do that always works. And then when it didn't, it was horrible.
But that's an interesting case. Is it necessarily a bad thing that everyone sat there in silence? I do remember an old print tutor saying to me that he had one tutorial with a student and asked them a question. And the student said, "Can I just have a moment to think about it?" And that moment extended to 20 minutes.
Right.
And so they sat there in absolute silence in 20 minutes. Now, I think I would have probably found that quite an uncomfortable experience towards the end.
Yeah.
But they sat there in silence, and at the end of it, the student said, I think what I want to say is this. And they had a wonderful discussion for the amount of time they had available.
Yeah.
And again, that tests a lot of assumptions. If you had a 30-minute tutorial and 20 minutes of that was silence, you think, is that a good thing?
Yeah.
But in that particular case, maybe it was.
Yeah.
Maybe it created the space for students to have that a thought they wouldn't have had otherwise. So, and I mean, that issue about silence, I think, is a brilliant one, because I think famously, from a teaching's point of view, silence is so awkward.
Yeah.
And it is a real good habit to get into, to hold silence.
Yeah.
Because I think, as a student, often I'm sat there and someone asks me a question, I'm thinking, I'm not going to say anything. Or I've said something already, so I'm going to be quiet. And you wait, and you wait. And that 20 seconds feels like forever. And you think, actually, there is a question I've asked. And if they say, well, actually, if no one's got any questions, and away we go. If someone had just waited that little bit longer, if you held that silence for 30 seconds, someone's got a question.
Yeah.
And I think it's a real effort of will to hold silences.
Yeah.
And sometimes we used to do a thing where we'd say, well, we're just going to hold the silence now. There's no question.
Yeah.
We're going to get together in this room and hold this silence. And 20 seconds feels like a long time.
Yeah. But it's worth it. Yeah. Sitting in that kind of discomfort is normally a really, really useful thing.
Yeah. And another example for me is that issue of forced silence. Is one of the student union sabbatical teams did a big project about what they called equal voices in the room. And that notion of how do you ensure that there's fairness in group discussions, which form so much part of the creative arts.
Yeah.
And they introduced me and other people who attended the session to the sort of the long table etiquette from Lois Weaver.
Right.
That notion of you imagining that learning space as a sort of like a dinner table, and only the people around the dinner table can speak. So it's a group tutorial. So you have a theme, you're talking, but only the people around the table can speak. Everyone else is an audience around the edge. And it was really interesting for a lot of people how uncomfortable they were with not being able to speak. Now, you could come into that conversation. What you could do is, if you wanted to contribute, you walked up to someone, just tapped them on the shoulder and asked them if you could come in. And they would leave the table and you would sit down at the table, and then you were one of those kind of 6 to 8 people who were then contributing to it. And I thought it was fascinating. And I thought it was fascinating to see the different dynamics. Some people maybe being encouraged to speak who wouldn't necessarily step forward. Also, chatterboxes like me going, oh, I've got something I really want to say. But you can't say it. The rules of this engagement are like, you can't say anything. So say, well, I can't say anything. I'm going to listen instead. And that was brilliant for me.
Yeah.
So in the end, I think I don't think I ever came to the table, or if I did, I came very briefly. And I'm thinking I'm really, really going to enjoy sitting and listening. And again, it's that taking of something as an implicit assumption and saying explicit, creating rules to tweak it and say, now how are you going to react? I thought it was brilliant.
It sounds brilliant, but it's also, I just saw something the other day about ADHD and the impulse for someone who has ADHD to interrupt, not because they want to interrupt, but because they simply have something that they need to say at that particular time. So I guess it's difficult sometimes to hold back with these things. And
I think that's a really good example of the fact that competing interests sometimes a little bit. People are very different, and people have different preferences. And when you are a teacher, when you're designing teaching, you have this impossible situation to some extent, that you've got incredible diversity of interests and experiences and perspectives around the table. And how do you accommodate it all? And there was a really big trend, sort of probably about 20 years ago, to define learning styles. Everyone was very excited about learning styles. And the idea is you would diagnose exactly what your preferences are, how your brain thinks. And everyone was very enthusiastic about it, and there were lots of different kind of mechanisms that kind of came out. And it was always back to that fundamental question, then what do you do as a teacher when you've got such a variety of people around the kind of the virtual or physical table? And learning styles has sort of died out a little bit, in part because it's not very robust as a kind of methodology. It's not reliable or kind of valid necessarily, or can't be demonstrated to be. And people change over time.
Well, and also people must say what they wish their learning style was, rather than what it is sometimes. Of course.
But I think for me, the sort of learning styles discussion has really kind of helped not necessarily to everyone to diagnose themselves and for a teacher to know all of this and be able to respond to all of this, but to actually have that open, explicit discussion. Rather than me knowing everything about everyone in the room, tell me. And you creating opportunities. What do you like? What's your preferences? And so it doesn't necessarily mean we'll always do what you want, because some of your interests might be competing. But at least if everyone is aware, Chris is going to continue putting his hand up and going, oh, I've got a point to make here.
Yeah.
And then also maybe think, well, maybe actually, if that's your instinct, great, we'll bring you in. But now be quiet and let other people come in and let them spend some time listening. As long as everyone understands what the preferences are, I think it's really useful. I mean, on the PG Cert a few years ago, someone did a project around just emotional check-ins. So at the start of a session, they were doing a workshop. How was everyone feeling? And it was really interesting that we'd very rarely ask that. How was everyone feeling right now? And hopefully in a kind of supportive environment, everyone's saying, well, actually, I didn't sleep at all last night, so I feel pretty wretched right now. Or I've got this going on, that going on. And suddenly you understood that rather than everyone being box fresh and coming into it as sort of eager students to learn, that everyone had problems. Everyone had, different levels of energy and enthusiasm for that particular day. And that you can adapt to that. You can sort of say, well, that's fine. Great. Sorry that you didn't have a good night's sleep, but when, for example, you're being a little bit behind the curve, I'll understand and I won't push you on that. I think it's really useful to have that level of dialogue. And it's something I, certainly as an individual teacher, I want to do more of.
Yeah, I guess it's about setting honesty as well, right? Yeah. And pulling down this divide, once again, between the master and the student. We're all in this together, and your teacher is just as likely to have had a bad night's sleep as you are.
Exactly.
I've got one final question that might be a bit too big, but here we go.
Okay.
In a time when there is no time, how do we make sure that we embed all of these productive ideas?
I mean, I feel the lack of time as much as anybody.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to give anyone else advice, because I'm always kind of quite shy of giving anyone advice if they haven't actively sought it.
Right.
All I can say from my own point of view is often it's an investment of time. I think if you're in a situation where you're not giving yourself enough time to prepare for something, whatever that might be, then yes, less likely to have a positive experience from that. So I think it's, for me, in terms of how I've done it, is a greater sense of prioritization, because there is quite a lot of time in the day.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things I'm doing are thinking, well, who's going to benefit from that? Am I going to benefit from that? Is anyone else going to benefit from that? And in which case, I'm going to invest my time in making sure that I've got, I've given myself enough time to kind of plan, but also to think about, well, what happens if it doesn't work? I think from a teaching point of view, I think that's really important, because you can design something which, as you said, and in your example earlier, you've tried something lots of times before, absolutely confident that it works, and it doesn't. And I think that happens all the time. It happens all the time in life, and it certainly happens in education when you're thinking, these people are not getting this. And I think it's invest the time in sort of preparing it, but also recognize it's not working. Yeah. What else are we going to do? And I think for me, it's a really tricky one, because I think all of us kind of do feel that kind of sense that we never have enough time to do all the things we do, or we don't recognize the competing demands that we might have. But I've never regretted investing a bit more time in something. I've never kind of said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to invest time in something that really matters to me and matters to other people. Yeah, I've never regretted doing that.
Great. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much for being with us here today, Chris, and being so generous with what you've given us. You've been listening to Arcast, the Royal College of Art podcast, home to the next generation of artists, innovators, and entrepreneurs, and the world's #1 art and design university. You can learn more about our programmes at rca.ac.uk, as well as finding news and events relating to the college and our application portal if you're a prospective student.